Welcome back. Both surveys and interviews rely on people responding to questions. They can even use the same or similar questions and get similar responses. So what is the difference between a survey and an interview? And how can choosing one or the other influence your research?
Interviews and surveys both consist of questions that are presented to individual participants. To distinguish them, I propose that if a researcher is present, either in person or virtually, when the participant is responding to the questions, it's an interview. If participants respond to questions without the researcher being present, it's a survey. Surveys always then use formats that do not require the researcher to be present. For example, paper questionnaires or online forms. In this way, surveys are always to a certain extent self-administered. Whether or not a researcher is present may not seem like a big difference. The respondent is the same, the questions may be the same, but the presence of a researcher opens up possibilities that can have significant implications on the resulting data. Let's look at some of the advantages and trade-offs with interviews and surveys. Some of the advantages of surveys include that they do not require coordinating a meeting between the researcher and participants. They make less demands on a researcher's time to administer. Surveys standardize question wording and question order across all surveys. Therefore, there's less variation in what participants are asked to respond to. It's often quicker for participants to complete a survey. Because they do not require the researcher to be there, surveys can allow for more participants and more responses. Because they're more standardized, surveys can be easier to analyze. Some of the trade-offs with surveys include that any problems with a survey instrument are harder to quickly identify. You often cannot see any problems with a survey until the results start to come back. Without the researcher being there to clarify, there's greater possibility of participants misunderstanding questions or instructions. Surveys are less flexible once they are administered. They focus only on the questions that the researcher think are important. Responses are limited to specific questions determined and put on the survey in advance. Survey responses can be shorter and less rich. It can also be harder to individualize questions or adjust questions to specific people using a survey. Interviews allow for personal contact with participants. They often allow the researcher to see the environment in which the questions were answered. The researcher is also able to see any emotional responses, social cues, and body language. Because they're there, the researcher is able to clarify questions and instructions. The researcher is able to ask additional questions. They can discuss tangents, follow up on topics, and let the interview follow the natural flow of the conversation. Because they're there, the researcher is able to move beyond what they initially thought was relevant. They can allow respondents to contribute the topics they think are relevant. Interviews can result in more data per respondent. They can be more personal, often allowing for more unique responses. Some of the trade-offs for interviews is that they are more time-consuming for both the researcher and participants. They require coordinating schedules. Depending on the location, they could expose researchers to unsafe situations. They are harder to keep anonymous. They can be more emotionally draining for the researcher. They can require more rigorous consent processes. There is usually less standardization across questions when compared to surveys. To summarize the main differences, because of the direct involvement of a researcher, interviews can be more open to individualizing and evolving data collection and are more able to capture context. Because they're self-administered, less researcher time is needed to complete a survey, potentially allowing for wider distribution and more respondents. Now that we know the key difference between interviews and surveys, in the next video, I'll introduce you to some terminology you'll need to discuss the different types of surveys and interviews. See you at the next video.